So our presentation is on Indigenous people and how they are represented in young adult literature. I am Kristen Engelmann.
I'm Ryan Morgan.
And I'm Tom New.
So first, we're going to look at some of the demographics. So there are 574 federally recognized Indian nations, which are otherwise known as tribes. In the past, these tribes have had many struggles and challenges, and those include genocide, dislocation, being taken or moved, forced off of their land, physical, mental, and social abuse, as well as being sent to boarding schools where they were forced to kind of get rid of their culture and become more white. Currently, they also have a variety of struggles and challenges. They have a lower life expectancy by 5.5 years. They have a higher death rate from diabetes, heart disease, liver disease, as well as suicide. I thought it was interesting that they're the highest youth suicide rate of all races and ethnicities is Indigenous people. Their rate of assault is higher, so 11.4% compared to all races of 5.4%. They also have incarceration is double the national average and nearly 4 times higher than Caucasians. In terms of poverty, 26.8% of Indigenous people live in poverty, compared to the nation, 14.6% live in poverty, and then only 17% of Indigenous people attend college, compared to the nation, whereas 60% of the nation attends college.
And if those demographics weren't shocking enough for you, the literature demographics are also quite staggering. For example, in 2021, 2.9% of the population identified as Native American. And then when you start to really break down the numbers for books, it gets a little like crazy. 2021, out of the 3,427 children's books, 60 were written by Indigenous people. That's 1.75% of books. And 74 written about Indigenous people. That's only 2.2% of those books and book numbers mentioned above. So that's quite staggering. Overall trends are increasing, though. In 2018, where 1.5% of books were about Indigenous people, 2019, it goes up slightly to 1.7% of books were about Indigenous people. And in 2020, where again, we're at 1.5% were written about Indigenous people and cultures. But again, that data obviously is impacted by COVID. And we'll talk about more of these numbers as we go through. Furthermore, publishing company data still reveals author homogeneity. 79% white, Caucasian, 78% women, cis women, 88% straight, heterosexual, 92% non-disabled.
All right, so like we mentioned earlier, there is very little representation of Indigenous YA literature. And part of that is because a lot of Indigenous YA texts are not physical texts, at least they weren't for a very long time. There's no real clear beginning to when Indigenous literature began, because it began in oral traditions. But around the early 20th century, some boarding school narratives started to become popular in literature. Around the mid 20th century, Indigenous YA stories kind of shifted to be focused towards a younger audience, specifically like middle school levels. In the late 20th century, Indigenous novels were shifted again to be geared towards an adult audience. And this is about the time that YA literature is beginning to form as its own category. So Indigenous literature didn't quite fit there yet, didn't quite find that audience as that was forming itself. Early 2000s, we started to see an emergence of power structures being represented in Indigenous narratives, and Indigenous literature really kind of split in the middle between two different types of protagonists within those power structures. Both types of protagonists yield to the power structures that are established in the societies that they exist in. So the first type of protagonist falls into the category of wanting to change their society, change that power structure, rebel against it, but they wind up making changes to themselves and having growth, individual growth, and accepting that as enough and then still existing within those power structures. The other group of protagonists, they rebel from the power structure. They want to change it, and then eventually come back to that power structure, accepting it for what it is and their place in it. And yeah. Okay, so we said that Indigenous representation has been increasing. It's been increasing since 2014, but there's still a huge gap, right? So there are several social movements that have been formed to kind of bridge that gap and address that lack of representation. So there is the We Need Diverse Books movement. This is a grassroots movement. It's nonprofit, and their goal is to promote and advocate for more diverse authors writing about diverse characters. There is the hashtag Own Voices, which kind of, again, it started on Twitter as a hashtag, but it became kind of a label for books that had characters who were a representation of the authors and vice versa. Then we also have the IASL Authentic Voices. This is a really useful resource. Again, same goal, but they have a collection that they continually update with diverse authors and diverse characters. So currently, Indigenous YA literature is evolving from the early 2000s, and we're seeing those changes, some really powerful changes. So we're seeing the demonstration of community. We're seeing Indigenous YA represent community in a very different way than typical YA novels, where YA characters are rebelling against their societies, rebelling against authority, rebelling against their communities. But Indigenous YA represents really an empowerment of belonging to a community. We're also seeing Native issues becoming more present and current, and that really challenges the historical perspective, that canonical perspective of Native American life and issues being something of the past. Specifically, we're seeing privilege being addressed, specifically in relation to education, housing, employment, really being challenged by Indigenous literature.
All right, moving on to authenticity. While this is certainly an issue for Indigenous populations everywhere, as I was researching, I found the plight of those native to Canada's region most interesting in light of the last few years and even decade. This ties in with some of the more recent news with residential schools, this ongoing, and almost you hear about it in increasing, like land disputes for native cultures, and just subsequently some of the ways that like they're losing culture representation because of this. So authenticity is really important in some of the articles I was finding. And so one of the articles, it's called Rights of Indigenous Children Reading Children's Literature Through an Indigenous Knowledge Lens by Red Bear Robinson, kind of talks about a lot of the stuff, how important it is to bring authentic authors to the table, especially for children and young adults, because they need that knowledge base from the different cultures. And so in the article, it mentions that authenticity is super important component to cultural reconciliation. And so they go in more in depth on that. And so, for example, access to authentic authors, and it's actually really cool. It talks about authentic speakers. Like, even if you can't, if you're talking about something in terms of Indigenous populations, get somebody who's authentically part of that population to be in the classroom or be a speaker, so that they can represent all the different backgrounds of the culture and explain the nuances and such. So it was really, really cool to see that in the article. Furthermore, in the past decade, more Indigenous authors have published books. We talked about this in our demographics earlier. They've published more books in Canada, and more Indigenous publishing companies have formed. I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about some of the grants and such, but there is this push to get more of, especially the publishing companies, to be more representative in this, push for Indigenous books. There's a really awesome quote. the presence of Indigenous publishers, authors, and illustrators in Canadian children's literature holds the promise that the worldwide worldviews and experiences of Indigenous children and their families and communities we honestly represented. And so you think about just how knowledge flows. It was about getting publishers and getting these companies to be more representative of the cultures that they wanted to talk about. So this is kind of helping again, and you'll see on the next slide as I talk about the money put forth in grants and stuff. Authentic voice and representation allows for explanations also in the nuances and variety within Indigenous culture. So we obviously, you know, in those earlier demographic slides, we talked about the vast number of Indigenous populations and the breakdown of how many tribes are spread out through North America. And so if you think about it, like for us just to say Indigenous populations is one thing, but to have these authentic authors and speakers to show that there's so much detail into the different cultures and what that all means, and to show the variety is just super, super important to adding authentic voice into your representation. Furthermore, equally as important for non-Indigenous children and adults, reading authentic Indigenous children's literature can lead to recognitions, especially of the inequities and to creating a respectful relationship that's necessary for reconciliation. So as you can kind of see in the tone, there's a lot, especially with what was in the news with the schools and other stuff. Like it's really right now in Canada about a lot of this reconciliation and how they're going to do that in this past decade. There's a lot of things have been coming to light and everything. And so in terms of trying to achieve authenticity, I found this very interesting grant. The Canada Council of Arts funded New Chapter as a part of a historic reinvestment in the arts. It's about 2017. There's a little bit of like a trailing off during the COVID years, but it's still around and still getting funded. The highly competitive program attracted over 2,000 applications, from which around 200 exceptional projects have been selected. It's kind of crazy. Like they showed like towards $500 million were like requested. And then out of the 35 million, they gave a breakdown. What was a little bit alarming in all these arts, the last two, one of them was literature. Only 2 million of the 35 million was going towards literature, which is still a huge amount. And they broke it down by the different provinces. And so it was, and territories. And so you saw like the breakdown, it was equitable across all of Canada. But again, like it would have been nicer to see more input towards literature. But again, it's the arts. So it really was spread across all of it. I think film, which kind of makes sense, was given the most, given production value and cost there. But kind of interesting. And one of the books I actually put in the annotated bibliography is a result of this. It's called This Place 150 Years Retold, which is kind of a retelling of Canada's Indigenous populations. And there's a hashtag for it if you want to check it out, hashtag Council New Chapter, just to kind of see some of the projects since 2017 and ongoing have come from this. So it's just kind of really cool to see, you know, 35 million put towards a whole purpose there. Now in the United States, there's three I found that are kind of interesting. The National Endowment for Arts, we've probably heard of that before. They provide grants for Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities. And their grants typically range from 10,000 to 100,000 for a variety of things. We need diverse books, which we discussed earlier. They also have a very interesting push for Native authors. And it was neat to see the breakdown of like the different things they offered in their grants. It wasn't just grants, but they also have programming, workshops, retreat, and conferences that Native authors can go to kind of get more into their craft. And then the last one, which is also really interesting, which is funded from Netflix, partially funded from Netflix, I should say, is the Native American Media Alliance, which offers $10,000 grants for individuals to kind of just like really jumpstart their careers. It seemed like it was like writing in terms of like screenwriting, but again, the craft, just to get more people writing and more Indigenous voices out there, I felt was what was really important. So again, like getting that authenticity comes from actual members of the Indigenous community.
So looking at the stereotypes that we see in terms of Indigenous people, some common stereotypes have to do with their language. So there's a thought that They may speak with grunts or not actual words, and you may see that depicted very stereotypically. You also see the idea of Indigenous people being represented as childish or naive. They are not knowledgeable about technology or the world or different things like that. There's this generalization that they all must live in teepees, whereas today, almost none of them live in teepees. You have the idea of a girl who is represented as this Indian princess and a boy who is represented as an Indian warrior. And that's kind of the only two things that they could possibly be. I also found it interesting, the stereotype of the rain dance, that a lot of tribes don't even have a rain dance. That doesn't even exist. They have different dances they do, they have different traditions, but that's a widespread idea of this rain dance, and it's kind of non-existent in most tribes. Looking at spirituality, you may see a stereotype on their spirituality in terms of their relationship with nature and how they may talk to Mother Nature, or they have this relationship with animals. And again, that is not always true. You also have dress. So thinking that all natives are wearing big headdresses, or they're wearing animal hides or have feathers in their hair. And a more modern stereotype has to do with alcoholism. So a lot of people assume that Indigenous people are alcoholics, where we know that that's not always true. Looking at these, so you're going to see these common stereotypes in literature, but you're also going to see other additional stereotypes that are in literature, such as the terminology that they use. So you may see them being called savages or red devils, crazy Indians. Sometimes they say they hardly look like men, really making them seem less than human. There's also sometimes a parody of their customs where they're really making fun of how they maybe dance or how they participate in various traditions. There is also an idea of a noble superhuman, this native that comes in and can do anything. And it kind of goes along with that idea of the Indian warrior. And then on the other hand, you have the idea of a Indigenous person who is savage and barbarous and subhuman. And that, again, you may see them come in and just kill everyone for no reason. That would be very stereotypical. In terms of their culture is often represented as being inferior. It's not good enough. It needs to change. The idea that they need to be more white. And then having Indigenous people really lack human warmth and vitality. So you may see them being represented as like never smiling, being very stoic, or not very loving in any way. So we see examples of these stereotypes in common literature, like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. You can see it in Huck Finn as well, Little House on the Prairie, The Indian in the Cupboard with that little Indian that was in the cupboard. You see like kind of his dress. If you've seen the movie that's remade, you maybe can picture that in your head, as well as Peter Pan, which again was made into a movie. And I think a lot of us can picture, I think it's the Tiger Lily Indian princess stereotype that we see there. So these stereotypes are extremely problematic. One of the biggest problems with stereotypes in terms of Indigenous people is that these stereotypes are promoted in our culture, and they're still promoted in our culture. So when you look at sports teams, a lot of sports teams have this stereotypical representation of this Indian warrior as their mascot because they think it's going to represent kind of a tough person who could take down the other teams. And some of these teams have changed their mascots and they're no longer representative of that Indian warrior, but that doesn't mean that they're not still kind of a part of our culture. So some of them being like the Washington Redskins, Atlanta Braves, Cleveland Indians, Chicago Blackhawks, and Kansas City Chiefs. Also, around Halloween, you may see stereotypical dress in terms of children who dress up as the Indian warrior or the Indian princess. On Thanksgiving, there are pageants that happen with the Pilgrims and the Indians, and the kids make those little paper crowns with the paper feathers. That's very stereotypical. We have a lot of movies that promote these stereotypical images, like Pocahontas is the Indian princess, and it's not historically accurate in terms of the Disney representation. The movie Stepmom has the Thanksgiving pageant where the boy is dressed as the Indian chief. So all of these have really created this acceptance of these stereotypical images of Indigenous people. So when people see them, it's very hard for most people to identify literature free of stereotypes, because you read these books and you think, oh, that's not a stereotype, that's fact, because you have seen them so much and they are so widespread, where in fact they are actually stereotypes. So that's very, very problematic, is because a lot of people do not recognize them as stereotypes. You also have this tribal portrayal. So different tribes have different traditions, different dress, different language. And when we look at these tribes in literature, they are portrayed as all being the same, or they may mix different traditions from different tribes together. So now it is not accurate to any tribe. So that's also very problematic. So we do see less stereotypes in more current works. And because there are so many different tribes, we said there are over 500 tribes. There has been this idea that has surfaced that only natives can really depict their own culture that is void of stereotypes. And that's just because there are so many stereotypes and people don't even recognize them anymore. So whether this is true or not, kind of you have to read the literature to really find out if it is void of stereotypes. But like I said, it's very hard for non-natives to recognize those stereotypes just because of that widespread media that we see.
For our annotated bibliography, our collection, we try to be really intentional about the voices that we included. So we were intentional about finding voices from different tribes, from different genres, and voices that reflected authenticity. So you can find all of that here in our annotated bib.
And then these are just our references. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to any of us. We are happy to answer any questions you have.